I want to do is look at ways in which we can use coinage to think about Roman power and different avenues of doing that. And I'll start with sort of the very obvious ways of doing it. Now I need to. So at a very basic level, and again, this will be familiar to many of the people here, and possibly we will go to sort of increasing infamiliarity if as the paper progresses, but there are faces on coins and there are images on coins, and that is completely bog obvious to us, but of course it wasn't always to the Romans. And we know the amount of discussion we got when Caesar got had his face on coins as the first living Roman emperor, and it's nice to notice how rapidly this normalizes. So the coin on the left is the recently auctioned Brutus coins for I don't know, £4 million, something along those lines, a ridiculous amount of money. On the right, another Brutus coin with the scepter. Do you actually see my arrow when I point at the screen as well? Thank you. With the scepter being broken. So very clear imagery of why Caesar as a dictator was being put away. But I like the fact that although we have this discussion about Caesar having his head on coins, even in the direct aftermath, it becomes completely normal for Brutus to have his on it. So the normalization of portraiture as a way to express power is striking and noticeable. Similar, very obvious point that is worth expressing is the fact that all the coins have full names on them. We've become so familiar to the ways coins are constructed, not just in the Roman period, but also afterwards, that we tend to forget just how new this type of legend was and how important that is if you see it regularly again and again and again. So we could take any sort of early Augustan coins, but the Imperator Kaiser Divi Filius, Augustus consul. Again, if I'm going to introduce myself with, hi, I am the conquering Caesar, son of a god, the elevated one, this is such a striking claim, and we know this from all the text, but we tend to, again, forget it because it's become so familiar. Having this name with the portraiture throughout the empire, with all sorts of legends of the type of deeds that this new man has established and done throughout his reign, shows an amount of power that really belies this notion of what we tend to call the Principate. So when we talk about the Republican facade, when we talk about political constructions, it's all true. So I'm not denying it. But when you look at the sort of objects that people handle throughout and were surrounded with, there is such a strong claim of universal and authoritarian power that, again, I think our familiarity with the objects tends to make us ignore the newness of that claim and the rapidity with that claim surrounded people. Now, that's looking at individual objects. The obvious great advantage of coins is that we have lots of them and we can trace them through time. And I think that's one of the main ways in which certainly I've been trying to use coins. And one fun thing to do is look at tracing these names through times. And this is something I've done in the Caesar Rules book, which came out 2 years ago or so. And again, you can start to tell a story by simply looking at the names or titles or whatever you want to call them that were placed on coins. And I apologize to people who've actually read the book, but I think for those of you who haven't, this is an interesting graph in that what it shows is over time a shift on the one hand in the names, but also a remarkable continuity. So the one name that certainly on coins is continuously and systematically put forward is that of Augustus. Right, so everything changes over time, but Augustus remains at a very high percentage of coins. Augustus, and I think the fact that Augustus so clearly becomes the title for Roman emperors allows us to explain things like this. So this is Carus, and if you look at it, it has the aug with the triple G. So we have 3 Augusti with Carus and Carinus and Numerian probably. But the fact that the name Augustus becomes, or the title Augustus, we can have an argument about that, becomes so clearly established as the cornerstone on coins of imperial authority means that if you have more of them, you simply have more Augusti, right? That sort of link is obvious. Other obvious things to look at is the arrival of Dominus or Dominus Noster, which becomes predominant, starts very, very late. In between, we have a disappearance of consul and imperator. Imperator and consul in the early period, really up to possibly the Antonine Severian, if you want to push it, is still there. Imperator stays, but consul disappears. So you see a shift of people trying to find how they are going to define or name it. And that shift is on the one hand similar, but on the other hand, very different from what we see on inscriptions. So inscriptions, you see Dominus arriving much, much earlier than it does on coins. And actually, as a PhD student of mine recently pointed out, if you look at inscription systematically, Imp Kais is really the defining feature much more than Augustus, already from the beginning. So you see how in these different media, we get different types of names, different kinds of messages that shift over time. I have no idea what you can really make out of that, but I think it is relevant to note. So by looking at these coins over time, you can start to see patterns of naming that you can't see in any other type of source, and they show you quite a lot about how people thought about emperorship. And certainly what this makes abundantly clear, without any shadow of doubt, that Augustus is the one name, the one title that everyone had. And I think that one could make a real argument, it's not going to work, but a real argument that rather than talking about the emperor of the Roman world, one ought to systematically talk about the Augustus of the Roman world. For many people, this is who he was, right? So our word of emperor is an interpretation of the role as we see it. If one looks at these names on coins or in inscriptions, you get much clearer to the position that people thought this ruler had. And they were very, very clearly, to a large extent, certainly in certain contexts, thinking about the Augustus. That was who he was, and that was who they were. And this, again, once you get to the Tetrarchy, you get to the Augustus Caesarus type of dichotomy, makes eminent sense. Okay, now certainly with Charlotte in the room, I'm going to now name the elephant in that room, which is that all of the graphs that I've been putting forward have been based on types. So in the past 2 decades or so, I've been trying to look at quantification of Roman coins and of images on Roman coins through an analysis of types. And that hasn't been out of principle, but it's been out of practice. It's basically up to very, very recently, and I think even still, if as a simple historian, and I should have actually introduced myself as a historian who happens to play with coins rather than a numismatist, so I apologize to all the people who really know about coins, but as a historian who really feels that coins are crucial to understanding how the Roman world worked, it was up to very recently completely impossible to work with proper hoard analysis, or you would only work from something like the Racademia hoard and hope that one hoard is sufficiently representative in itself, which brings all sorts of problems with it. Whereas RIC, with all of its problems, not least of which that it's completely inconsistent of what a type is and is very unclear on when a type is common or when it's rare, but with all its inconsistency, was and still is the only complete overview of the coins of the Roman Empire. And it becomes very complicated when you start to bring the Eastern Roman Empire or the Byzantine Empire in, which we should as well. And certainly with ochre online being there, it became so easy to start, well, it became relatively easy to start making the types of graphs that I've just shown you, or a graph like this one, which from Augustus to really well into the 5th, 6th century can start differentiate types of messages. And I think that is worthwhile. I think that although there are problems with types, and although types don't necessarily show quantification at the level of objects, right? So the obvious thing, and I will explain this to the 3 people in the room who may not know it and apologize to the rest. The problem with types is that 1 gold type and 1 bronze type count as the same in a type range, whereas we know that almost always many more bronzes of 1 type will have been issued than of the gold. And we also know that certain types were issued so much more frequently than other types. When you go to Tiberias, there is 1 type from Lugdunum with which we know was issued, I think something 60% of his coins are that type. And you can't see that when you look at types as quantification, right? So this is the problem with it. I still think it's worth doing, basically because there is no other way of doing this easily. And the advantage, as I think I said it elsewhere, the advantage of having partial sight over no sight to me is still one that's worth having. So if you do a quantitative analysis of types, it gives you a very rough overview of the types of patterns that you get. And certainly once we get to something like what I've just shown you, the Augustas, it doesn't really matter when we talk whether we're talking about types or hordes here. Once you get to 90+%, that's not going to change. Once you get to these sort of differentiation, and I have no idea whether your screen is big enough to see this, but this is a very rough division of the types of messages on the reverses of coins, showing, for instance, that the military type of messages really increase in the later period at the cost of cult and devotion. That gives us a rough idea of how this may have worked, but these images may be heavily distorted once you start to quantify at a horde level, because it's very possible that gold coin has a very different way of working here than bronze coins when you start to talk about audience targeting. Okay. Now we can start to increasingly balance this with the evidence of hordes. Charlotte has just taught me before this paper started that she is increasingly not only looking at the horde material, but also putting it in a database and ultimately going to put it online, which is brilliant. Corey Ellithorpe has done wonderful work with horde analysis of gold coins, and these images here he gave to me, which shows you that certainly on gold coins in certain periods we get very different messages than looking at the entire coinage. So just to explain this on the right is the percentage of dynastic images on gold coins under the Julio-Claudians. Now, that is much more than once you start to look at all types together. So there is a shift. So as I said, I think this is worth doing, but it is problematic and one needs to be aware of it. The state of research as it is now only allows us to do quantification rapidly through ochre. That's worth doing, and it gives us trends. These trends then need to be checked, and you can either do that by taking massively single hordes or getting people like Corey to do the work for you. But this is an appeal to all those numismatists who are sitting on horde material to put it out there, because for historians, that's the only way forward. Okay, other way of thinking with coins, other approach of looking at this is starting again to look at single objects and how they can be traced through time. So this is quantification through time. This is, as it were, iconography through time. And a very obvious thing, again, to notice is that the normalization of Roman coinage was such that when what we tend to call the end of the Roman Empire happens, coins continue. Right? This is, again, we see this but don't reflect on it. So this is a 5th century Vandal coin struck under either Gaiseric or Huneric, and for those of you who are less well acquainted with what we tend to call the late Roman period, this is 5th century Vandals and Alans who become part of who take over once the Roman West becomes a more disparate range of small kingdoms, and these are the people who then through the Iberian Peninsula end up conquering North Africa and becoming the Vandal kingdom. Now you can just about read that this says Honorius, and this is it says Orbs here, this is the goddess Rome holding a victory. It doesn't look odd to us because it's such a familiar image. But this is a Vandal king striking coins in the name of the Roman Augustus, putting Rome on the reverse. So apparently this iconography of power has become so ingrained into what people expect representation of power through coins to be, that it becomes almost impossible to get away from it. Right? Just once you sit down and think about it for a second, imagining that a new system in power continues to use the exact images and iconography of the group of power that they replaced is rather striking. And the fact that these coins are familiar means that we tend not to see it. A very extreme way of that, and one of my favorite coins in the world, is a Vandal numis from North Africa. Now this says Carthago, and this is a Carthaginian horse. So in the 5th or 6th century CE, Vandals replacing Rome, on the one hand, continue the exact imagery of what we call Roman power, but on the other hand, start striking coins, creating a continuity with Carthage. We know that Neo-Punic was still spoken. We know that there's more Carthaginian images, but the fact that this coin is used as a basis is important. It also, again, looking at how coins show power, is useful to start thinking about how this happened. And we don't know. So it's possible that this is continuation of Carthaginian images. It is, of course, also possible that this is simply because a number of Carthaginian coins were found in this period, right? We don't know whether this is because people simply stumbled upon objects and thought, oh, these are cool, let's copy these, or whether we are talking about continuity. Yeah? Ways in which we can talk about continuity is, again, looking over time at the individual iconographical development. So again, this is not quantification, but it is using the great advantage of having a series. And you can do this for all sorts of ways, but Christianization is one of the most fun ways of looking at that link between Christianity and power, and the way that developed is completely and utterly obvious once you start to look at coins, with Anastasius already clearly making the Christian emperor clear by putting a large cross in the hand of Victoria. And then we can see over time, first, a wonderful shift from Victoria to angel. So we go from the female Victoria to the male angel, though still addressed as the Victory of Plural Augusti. And then massive shift in the 7th century once Christ becomes the obverse and the emperor in the reverse, holding a cross. Again, one can do this in, I could give an entire paper on how this development works in small steps with the cross-topped orb, or with the slight shift in Victory. but this is a bog obvious one. The moment you see that the iconography becomes increasingly systematized and then becomes iconographically Christian, and then we get the figure of Christ rather than the emperor on the obverse, these are types of shifts that show a real change in the way power was represented and the way power was perceived. This is a different beast than before, and I've been increasingly vocal about how the term late antiquity is a wrong one we should all get rid of, because there is an enormous amount of continuity in how the Roman Empire in West and East functions. I think that here, so from the 7th century onwards, we really do have a different empire, that the fundamental basis of how power is being construed and how emperorship is being understood and who is really sovereign has shifted to an extent that it would have become unrecognizable for the earlier period. Though they still obviously call themselves Roman and are Romans, and it's just us calling them Byzantines. Continuity change over time at a slightly more minor basis, also visible once you get back to the names. Now this is a beautiful gold coins of Heliogabalus. So many of the coins I've shown you are completely unrepresentative and just pretty pictures, but they are there because I want to make sort of points of the individual coins. It's this bit here, all right? It's the Pius Felix. So from Commodus onwards, Pius Felix as a combination becomes normalized, or it becomes there on coins from Caracalla, it becomes standard. And this idea of PF as an integral part of coins becomes established. Now, this one would expect to become problematic once you are in a Christian empire, because Pius Felix doesn't quite work for Christian rulers. And the wonderful thing is that we can see how PF continues on coins. Throughout, Christian coins use PF. It's here on Constance. I probably should have given a later coins as well. So you see that later coinage, 5th century coinage, still has PF in its legend. So if one were to simply only look at coins, you would expect continuity and we would be surprised. The explanation for how this works is once you start to look at inscriptions as well, where one sees the same PF, but because inscriptions probably have slightly more space than coins, or also because its convention, its legend conventions are slightly different and less systematic, we see that what we knew was Pius Felix beforehand is quite often Perpetua Felicitas, which is perfectly acceptable and wonderful for Christians. So in inscriptions, you see the Pep fell, Pai fell, and you can see how you can shift this differentiation, and that you can keep the conventions that you knew, because conventions are extremely difficult to break, but change their meaning. So I've been talking about individual coins. I've been talking about our thinking about coins and reading through it. I've been talking about quantifications and the problems with it. This is a heartfelt plea to all numismatists and all historians to never focus on only one type of material. I think that once we look at only one type of material, be they texts, be they coins, be they inscriptions, we run the risk of no longer seeing the entire view, because people in the Roman world were looking at all these objects. They were surrounded by an objectscape that included not just coins, but also inscriptions. And once you've seen the Pep fell, the Perpetua Felicitas once, you will see it on the coins as well, because this is how cognitive dissonance works. It's wonderful how this process works, but you won't be able to see it if you're not looking at the world as a whole. So this is not just a plea to ancient historians to use coins, because not all of us do this sufficiently, but also to numismatists to not only use coins. Okay, so far I have been talking about coins, and I have not mentioned probably the most important innovation in working with coins in the past 20 years, certainly for me, and that is the arrival of the Roman provincial coinage project. So for those of you who aren't using this at a daily basis, do. The Huidige Huygens Burnett volume, now almost 20 years old, on the sort of questions that we can ask of provincial coinage, I think is still fundamental and really worth looking at. But the fact that we have now open access online, an almost complete overview of coins that were minted by the autonomous cities or the so-called friendly kings, with all the information about it, is just amazing if one wants to get a look on how Roman power was not just experienced. I think that's at the beginning, people were really talking about the difference, and I think I've done that too, between producing an image and receiving an image. We are really talking about how this image was produced in the provinces as well. We are talking about co-production, and the wonderful thing about having the RPC project is that you can start to see loops. Certainly the most recent volume on coins from the Alexandrian mint that Chris Houdigo has just published, and which is already in there, I think, shows you a feedback loop in which certain changes really start in Alexandria and then picked up in Rome, although on the other hand, the Alexandrian mint tends to follow the Roman mint. So you can see how power is being understood, experienced, and produced both at the center and in the provinces. Once you start doing that, and this is from a recent JRS overview of the RPC project that Erika Manders and I did, a number of things are instantly striking. Now, at a more minor level, provincial coins show us individuals that we don't have on central coins. I really like the fact that we have Vespasian the Younger on the Smyrnian bronze coins. We know sod all about him because he wasn't relevant clearly at the center, but in Smyrna he was. So power is constructed at a local level as much as it at a central level, and power constructed at a local level may be different from power constructed at a central level. I think that, again, is worse. It's obvious the moment you start thinking about it. We approach local representatives different than we do central representatives, and at a local level we may not go to our councillors, we may go to businessmen because they have a larger say in what happens in a town or village than the politicians. This applied in the Roman world as well, and you can see that played out on provincial coinage. So that's one avenue to explore. The other avenue that I think is worth exploring is, again, quantification. Now, this is counting the coins, and because we know that coins tend to show members of the dynasty, this percentage to us isn't surprising. But it is the moment you start thinking about it. We have a Roman Empire which continuously claims to be a res publica, in which the figure of the emperor remains undefined, in which succession is dynastic but isn't dynastic, in which we have lots of legal text and ancient historians, as in historians, Roman and Greek historians, talking about their world, who are really uncomfortable with this notion of dynastic succession. Lots of modern historians talking about it and writing big books about whether it was dynastic or not. But within one generation, 65% of provincial coins shows the family, and within 2 generations, it becomes 90+%. That shows that we are talking about an empire in which the vast majority of the people not only understood that it was a family who was in power, but were also completely comfortable with it. If you start to look at who is actually depicted on the coins, it's also interesting that these are living people. So whereas on central coinage, it's much easier to pick dead members of the family because they are dead and no longer a problem and still show the notion of a dynasty. On provincial coinage, you put the living people because they can still do you a favor. You put someone on a coin to show that you honor them, and there's clearly reciprocity involved. And that might be one explanation. That might be one explanation in a different way why Titus and Domitian are actually not as common on provincial coins as they are on central coins. On central coin, they are really, really dominant, even more than on provincial coins. That may be because when they are being depicted, they're still young to really do favors. So on central coinage, you put forward a message of continuity and stability after civil war. It makes eminent sense why Vespasian puts his sons on there to show that there's now going to be continuity. We're not going to have another civil war for generations to come. We're safe. That's a proper message on central coinage. On provincial coinage, Titus and Domitian at this stage aren't going to do anything for you, whereas living wives might. And Vespasian the Younger might, because Vespasian the Younger can actually talk to his brother and try to push him to get measures through. So again, looking at provincial coinage in a quantitative way shows us how rapidly this idea of dynasty becomes normal, but it also tells us how people thought they could approach their emperor and their ruler, and that was through children and women. And this is again something which you can see in inscriptions as well. It's perfectly normal to approach Livia. It's perfectly normal to start approaching one of the Faustina or Sabina or a Matidia. This is what you do because they have the ear of the emperor. It's only our central texts who find this problematic because women in power are a problem. That's just the male senators. For the rest of the world, this is perfectly normal because this is how you deal with autocrats. And again, this is something when you start to look at it comparatively, any type of autocracy, people try to find their way to the man, usually the man, in power. And that is often through women and freedmen. And you want to suck up to them. You want to make sure that they're on your side, and putting them on coins is a very obvious way of doing it. I've talked about normalization a lot. I think even when we start to look at provincial coinage, you see something very similar. These are coins from Aphrodisias, simply because I'm exploring some questions about Aphrodisias with a couple of colleagues at the moment. And what struck me is if you look at the pre-Augustan Sesostri and you look at the Augustan one, there's very clearly a continuity of iconography and imagery that even though this is a different beast, it is clearly using the types of images that people were familiar with. So if one starts to look at theoretical notions that we know from linguistic analysis, the idea of common ground in which people only understand each other when they have a joint point of reference becomes interesting. So this is less new. It's, to use another term, it's anchored into existing iconography, that although you get different types of images, although you have a new person in power, although we get a slightly different measurement because the Augustan coins are really based on more on Roman types of denominatives, the imagery is one that people already recognize, and whether that is the imagery of the coin or whether that's imagery from the mythology, so using the famous axe in Aphrodisias, which from the narratives we know Sulla bestowed the golden axe, or whether you put Aphrodite on it, it shows that once you start to put something new into place, like the image of one figure on the front who's ruling the world, you want, on the other hand, to make sure that it isn't all too new. So this tension between continuity and change is one that I think is both interesting and visible through coins. Okay, two more avenues to explore, and then I'll give up. But one is one that we tend not to look at a lot, which is things that aren't there. And absence of evidence is hardly ever evidence of absence, but it is on coins. This is the cool thing. Once you have a complete set of text and images over time, it means that messages that aren't on that coin weren't on that coin. I'm not saying they weren't there, but if the images aren't on the coins that we have, we can really quite certainly argue that they weren't on coins. And in an earlier article, I've been starting to look at the idea of justice, which, according to our senatorial text, is the most important role of emperors, and the emperor giving justice and responding to notions of justice, and the emperor as a lawgiver. That is the image that, since Fergus Miller's seminal Emperor in the Roman World, has really defined our way of thinking about emperorship. And a wonderful recent book by Tuari on the emperor and law again pushes this image, which senators put forward very, very strongly forward. And clearly this was important to senators. I'm not saying that it wasn't important, but it isn't on coins. So the slightly darker green are notions of justice in the wider sense, as you can see then on imperial coins. It's not there. This is not a message that's being pushed. Now that's interesting, and I think there may be other types of messages that aren't there. And the cool thing about coins is it's the one source material where we can really argue if it isn't being put forward, then clearly this was not a message that was being pushed, at least on coinage. Another one that I very recently started to look at is images of the Senate. They aren't really on coins. So SC is, of course, Senatus Consulta. That's one way of doing it. SPQR very occasionally is. But images of the genius of the Senate, there's 80 in ochre. That's very, very, very little. This may shift if some of these types end up being extremely frequent, and if a coin hoards give us lots of them. Recadevnia doesn't. That's sort of my back way of sort of first check is look at a massive hoard and see if it's giving something completely different. It doesn't. So it's quite nice if one would start to push this and say, are there all sorts of images that are particularly senatorial in terms of emperorship and power, so important to Senate, that perhaps these aren't on coins, because they needn't be on coins, because coins are circulating throughout the empire to a much wider audience where senators can approach the emperor directly. And this, again, not saying this is the case, but it's worth thinking in those lines. Senate isn't much more represented on provincial coinage. There are 606 that I found. Interestingly enough, again, this is very tentative, this doesn't really seem to shift much over time. Right, so if one looks, and this is a division of the books of RPC, and it's problematic because not all of them are on there, but you don't seem to see a massive differentiation over time. Final way to play with coins, and that is the physical object. I think it'd be perverse to talk about coins and not talk about the physical objects. And I will give you two case studies, both of which others have published about, but are not as well known as they should be. So this is my way of telling you these are really interesting coins. Have a look at them. This is one. I think most of you will recognize Vespasian. This is the first image of Justitia, right? The justice, which I said was rarely depicted on coins. It is rarely depicted on coins. This is the first instance of Justitia, and it's a very weird, static depiction of Justitia. She doesn't really look like a normal Justitia. And the Judea Capta coin is there for purposes. Because, Chris, how'd you go? A long time ago, when looking at this coin, when it got into the Ashmolean museum, noticed, bear with me, that there seem to be very odd marks within the legend. And once you trace those marks, he argued, there was a legend before in the mold showing pietas. And this figure actually could equally well have been originally a pietas changed into justice by putting the weird scales in there. Now, if that's the case, it's interesting because we know from analysis of the material and found place that this coin was almost certainly minted in the East, in Judea, in which obviously one of the largest temples of the Roman world had just been destroyed. And one could make the argument that putting forward pietas is not the best claim after destroying one of the larger temples of the world, even if it is the God of the Jews, and that justice, on the other hand, is a very obvious one. If so, you see very late tampering with physical objects, probably in this case not the coin, but the mold, to adapt imagery. Even more fun and even more physical object are these coins of Maximinus, which Johannes Wienand has published about a couple of years ago. For those of you who, again, are perhaps less familiar with 3rd century history, Maximinus ends a particularly gruesome death with his head on a stick, which is what happens with his coins as well. So this is physical adjustment of the individual coins in which this type has been reworked on physical coins, and we have several copies of this showing the emperor with his head on a stick, both on the obverse and the reverse, so the victory becomes him dead as well. And this shows how people engage with individual coins. And again, this is fun. That's one reason to show it. It shows you that these objects are objects. It also shows that clearly people had strong feelings with what these coins meant, because otherwise you're not going to do it. This is not destroying the coins. This is circulating a different message. I have no idea, and I'd be very interested if we can ever find out whether this would still be legal tender, or whether in destroying this you also destroy the coin as a value. The legend is mainly there, so I don't know. Okay, so what I've been doing in the past 40 minutes is showing you very different ways of looking at coins, and ways in which I've in the past been thinking about the link between coins and Roman power. I want to end with one of the first things I found interesting about coins when I started to work on Commodus a long time ago, and stumbled upon this coin. So my argument's been that depending on the questions that you ask, you need to approach with different methods, and that anyone who's going to be very principled about the way you need to deal with numismatics is probably not going to be able to ask historical questions. My final type of method is one of just accepting that occasionally things happen because they happen. This is Commodus as Hercules. I think you all approach this, and I apologize in advance that I don't know you and start to talk about all sorts of insensitive things in what is very early morning to me. But this is the Herculi Romano Augusto, so for the Roman Hercules the Augustus, with a club in the middle. Now just read the right part on the right of the club. I'm not going to translate it to you because I don't think I can, I'm legally allowed to do that. But this is rather a perverse statement being put on the right, and a club is not going to help it. If this is a teaser, go and put it into Google Translate. It probably will do Latin as well. This cannot have been the intention. Either this was a joke of people pointing out that Commodus' rear part was burning because of clubs, but you're not doing that with a ruling emperor. So this is probably just a mistake that was corrected rapidly afterwards. But that tells you that once you start working with imagery and text, occasionally things simply go wrong, and that even though we talk about large patterns and experimenting and modes of power, we are talking about objects that are being constructed, and things happen because they do. And I think that's also worth taking into account. And that's I think what I want to talk about, what I wanted to talk about in terms of coinage and power. So that's it. Very happy to hear questions, and thank you for your attention.